The lines were long, the crowds were large. The world has been waiting for this moment.
I'd ask you to please stand, raise your right hand.
Good evening, I'm Mark Kelly, and this is The National.
Those were lies, plain and simple.
The former FBI director testifies about his relationship with President Trump and what led to his firing. In a campaign dominated by Brexit, austerity, and 2 terror attacks, Britons go to the polls. A bird's-eye view of danger in the North Atlantic. We're on board with the International Ice Patrol. And Canada sets a new course on the global stage and on defense. Why and what does it mean? Chantal and Andrew are here on that. He was a calm, measured, impeccably prepared witness. Perhaps the kind he would have loved to have faced in court in his former life as a lead prosecutor. Today, James Comey was on the other side as former head of the FBI to answer questions from U.S. lawmakers about Donald Trump, Russia, and being fired.
I was fired because of the Russia investigation.
And Comey asserted that in the days that followed, the president publicly lied, both about him and the FBI. Comey's appearance, it was hoped, would help separate the truth from the lies.
This is not a witch hunt. This is not fake news.
His 3-hour testimony addressed Trump's request to Comey for loyalty, what Trump said to him in private about former White House security advisor Michael Flynn, and in a surprising revelation where one of the leaks that irks the president so much actually came from.
As a private citizen, I felt free to share that. I thought it very important to get it out.
At the heart of it all, of course, was the investigation into whether Russia meddled in the 2016 U.S. election.
The Russians interfered in our election during the 2016 cycle. They did it with purpose. They did it with sophistication.
For his part today, Trump appeared less concerned with that than with the fact that Comey was talking at all.
And as you know, we're under siege. You understand that.
Finally, there was one big question many hoped to hear answered today, whether Comey believed the president obstructed justice. There's a lot to unpack from this day, and we begin with Paul Hunter in Washington.
Under intense pressure, amid over-the-top anticipation, James Comey came to Capitol Hill ostensibly to tell all. So what did he say? Not least, that he believes President Donald Trump to be a liar.
Director Comey, you're now under oath.
On being fired by Trump as FBI director, Comey testified,
The administration then chose to defame me and, more importantly, the FBI by saying that the organization was in disarray, that it was poorly led, that the workforce had lost confidence in its leader. Those were lies, plain and simple.
and on why he made careful notes after private conversations with Trump, something he'd never done with previous presidents, said Comey, because he simply didn't trust Donald Trump.
I was honestly concerned that he might lie about the nature of our meeting, and so I thought it really important to document. It led me to believe I got to write it down, and I got to write it down in a very detailed way.
A key aspect of today's hearing, before senators examining whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to meddle in last year's election, is whether Trump has obstructed justice, an impeachable offense. Said Comey, in a conversation about Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor then under criminal investigation over his contacts with Russia, Trump told Comey, I hope you can see your way to letting this go.
I was so stunned by the conversation.
In Comey's view, Trump was pushing him to curtail his investigation.
I took it as a direction. Right. I mean, this is the President of the United States, with me alone, saying, I hope this. I took it as, this is what he wants me to do. Now, I didn't obey that, but that's the way I took it.
So, is that obstruction?
I don't think it's for me to say whether the conversation I had with the President was an effort to obstruct. I took it as a very disturbing thing, very concerning.
That said, it's clear to Comey the real reason he was fired by Trump.
I was fired because of the Russia investigation. I was fired in some way to change, or the endeavor was to change the way the Russia investigation was being conducted. That is a very big deal.
Such a big deal that at one point Comey said he felt he had to leak his story to the New York Times, so he gave copies of his notes to a friend who passed them on, and here we are.
Mr. President, any reaction to Comey's testimony? Any reaction at all?
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Do you think he told the truth?
Trump himself answered no questions on Comey's testimony today, but sent a statement via his personal lawyer, who highlighted Comey's testimony suggesting Trump isn't personally under investigation.
The president feels completely vindicated and is eager to continue moving forward with his agenda, with the business of this country, and with this public cloud removed.
And on the matter of Trump and the truth, said a spokeswoman today, off camera,
I can definitively say the president's not a liar, and I think it's frankly insulting that that question would be asked.
but there remain multiple investigations on the broader questions in play. And for those, Comey's testimony today will no doubt be studied carefully. Likewise, those notes he took after those meetings with Trump, not to mention the possibility, as Trump himself has suggested, there might be secret audio tapes of those conversations.
I've seen the tweet about tapes. Lordy, I hope they're tapes.
And indeed, on that, said Comey,
all I can do is hope. The president surely knows whether he taped me, and if he did, my feelings aren't hurt. Release all the tapes. I'm good with it.
Audio tapes aside, Comey was asked, why should anyone believe him? His answer, look at what he said over time. He's tried to be open, fair, transparent, and accurate. 4 words he likely would not use to describe the president. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
So what many want to know more than anything else is, how deep does this really cut? Did the testimony hurt Trump, or could he call today a win? Keith Bogue joins us now for more insights. Keith, what, if anything, really changed today?
Well, Mark, it's pretty difficult to argue that when the former director of the FBI calls the sitting president of the United States a liar, that's not a big deal. It is a big deal, especially when you consider that Comey wanted that on the record. It was a considered remark behind which he put all of his integrity and his reputation as a prosecutor and an investigator. At the same time, though, it's not exactly news that the president isn't fanatical about telling the truth. Remember, during the campaign, fact checkers found that most of what Trump said was either mostly false or completely false. So it's not exactly a revelation in this case either.
All right, so if nothing really changes, is that good or is that bad for the president?
Well, I think as tough as Comey's testimony was, and it was tough, it didn't really put anything new on the table. It didn't really put anything out there that hadn't already been reported in the media. It merely confirmed it. In the process, of course, he also confirmed Trump's contention that Comey had 3 or 4 times told him he was not personally under investigation by the FBI. So in the long 5 months of the Trump presidency, you've got to think that his team was saying, you know, this isn't the worst day that we've ever had. And though they didn't kill the story, well, it doesn't really seem to have got any worse for them either.
Yeah, vindication, as they have called it today at the White House. All right, Keith, thanks so much. James Comey's testimony had been billed as a media mega event. Many Americans even bailed on work today to watch it live at the local pub. But what did they have to say about all of this? Did it live up to the hype? Our Stephen D'Souza hit the streets to see what the public had to say.
In Washington, the lineup to watch the Comey hearing went out the door. In Brooklyn, the crowd spilled out onto the sidewalk. In LA, they were pouring Russian vodka with breakfast as the event billed as the political Super Bowl brought a politically divided country together in front of the TV.
The facts don't look good, but I'm still willing to believe that there was no collusion between the Russians and the campaign.
Across the U.S., bars opened early to host watch parties, some with specially themed cocktails, like the impeachment. Some had no time for drinks, hanging on James Comey's every word.
Comey seems very confident and clear-headed to me, speaking with conviction. I'm imagining our president up there answering similar questions, and the contrast is noticeable.
There was no watch party at this diner on Trump-friendly Staten Island, just a large helping of political theater to go with the food.
It should have never even started. This is a waste of our money for our country. The Democrats are still in denial from losing.
For the Democrats a few tables away, a much different take.
I always say, let truth prevail, all right? That's why it's being investigated. That's America, so that's great.
While Comey wouldn't flat out say the president obstructed justice, for some here, it's a foregone conclusion.
Are you serious? Absolutely. I know you had to ask that question.
But for others, talk of obstruction is fake news.
Now it's his word against his, right? Is there any tapes?
Back at the Democrat table, they're hoping today's testimony fuels more talk of impeachment.
He's telling us things that we didn't know behind the scenes, more or less, not known to the public. And I think that's very important. A lot of people become aware, and then maybe they will take notice, and maybe they'll do something about it.
Judy Barnett voted for Trump. Now she's not sure she would do it again.
Yeah, he should face the consequences. Maybe we should put him on trial. But he'll lie. They all do.
As the discussions and debates continue, one thing most here agree on: it will take a while for the country to digest what came out of today's hearing. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
Well, some may have mixed feelings about who came out on top today, Trump or Comey, but political commentator and author David Frum is not one of them. David joins me now from Washington. David, I was reading your piece in The Atlantic that you wrote this afternoon. You start with, "It was a bad, bad day for Team Trump." How so?
Team Trump has a number of explanations of why the Comey testimony is not damaging, and 5 that I itemized in the article, and one by one they are pierced. Here's how bad, though, it was. Donald Trump has a lawyer. He went through four major law firms, turned him down because he doesn't pay his bills. So he's known as 5th choice of lawyer. His lawyer is an effective commercial litigator, but someone new to the ways of Washington. And he put out a statement immediately after the hearing in which he said that Comey had betrayed privileged conversations between the president and the FBI director. Well, that is a remark that suggests no idea of how the principle of executive privilege works, and in particular that, as was established during Watergate, that executive privilege does not cover if the president has said things that might point toward a crime. Comey today, in his testimony, was convincing, he was credible, and he was consistent. And he also revealed something that we did not know, which is that the Attorney General had 3, not 2, as was previously assumed, undisclosed meetings with the Russian ambassador about which the Attorney General did not tell the truth.
Well, I want to pick up because you're mentioning the president's lawyer, Mark Kasowitz. I mean, he came out with his statement, essentially said, well, he said that the president was vindicated in his words, and in essence called Comey a liar and a leaker. Let's listen to a little more what Mark Kasowitz had to say.
From before this president took office to this day, it is overwhelmingly clear that there have been and continue to be those in government who are actively attempting to undermine this administration with selective and illegal leaks of classified information and privileged communications. Mr. Comey has now admitted that he is one of these leakers.
So in essence, it seems to be that the Team Trump wants to put Comey in with this sort of deep state idea that they have, that they claim to be operating against the president. Do you think this is going to be an effective strategy?
So that's gibberish. I mean, it sounds like legalese, but it's gibberish. To anyone who actually knows anything about how the law works, that's just gibberish. It makes no sense. Look, here's the core of the Trump defense. That they say, the president asked Director Comey in January, am I the target of an investigation? Now, at that point, the FBI is investigating a massive espionage attack on the United States. It's already amazing that the president-elect of the United States would say, by the way, when you're looking for spies, am I a spy? And Comey was able to assure him at that point that, Mr. President-elect, you personally are not a target of this espionage investigation, just your campaign. That's all. And the Trump people say, well, that's our vindication. They were only looking for espionage in our campaign, not the president-elect himself, and therefore we are vindicated. For the director then to talk about these conversations after the president tweeted them, after the president said he had taped them, after the president said, I am not invoking executive privilege at these hearings, for the president's lawyer to say the director to talk about his own notes and his own experience is illegal or subject to privilege, as I say, it's gibberish. It just doesn't make any sense. It's law talk. It's not law.
Well, it's interesting because Comey seemed to anticipate that the attacks would come about his credibility, and he mentioned this in a question in the back and forth in the hearing today. Let's take a listen to something Comey had to say for himself.
I think people should look at the whole body of my testimony, because as I used to say to juries, that when I talked about a witness, you can't cherry pick it. You can't say, I like these things he said, but on this, he's a dirty, rotten liar.
Right.
You got to take it all together, and I've tried to be open and fair and transparent and accurate. A really significant fact to me is, so why did he kick everybody out of the Oval Office?
Do you think that there's any traction to be made here trying to attack Comey's credibility after his appearance today?
Zero. Look, if you go onto YouTube, there are dozens of hours of video of people do this for sport, of saying, Donald Trump saying, I never said X, and then there'll be a clip immediately after of Donald Trump saying X. That Donald Trump, both the polls suggest and the objective reality suggest, is the least credible occupant of the Oval Office, certainly in modern times, maybe ever. Not everyone loves James Comey. He is a person of sometimes kind of overbearing rectitude, and he has made some enemies along the way. But if James Comey says a fact, he doesn't lie about that. There are people who have problems with some of his demeanor, but he is a truthful person, and Donald Trump just is not. A former deputy mayor of New York who worked with Trump before Trump ever entered politics famously said, I wouldn't believe Donald Trump if his tongue were notarized.
Well, the key, I guess one of the big unanswered questions or people were hoping to get a little bit more insight on was this whole idea of whether there was obstruction of justice. Right. Let's take a look to a little bit of the exchange and what Comey had to say about that.
When a president of the United States in the Oval Office says something like, I hope, or I suggest, or would you, do you take that as a directive?
Yes.
And this is on this issue of hope. Was he instructed, or is hope just a mild suggestion? You know, there was a question that some have said there was no smoking gun today in his testimony. I know you have an opinion on that.
Well, there is no smoking gun, but there is a warm weapon with a discharge chamber, some casings on the floor, and bullet holes in the walls. So we have to do the inference. Look, when the president says, I hope X will happen, maybe that's just a wish. But when X doesn't happen and he fires the person to whom he expressed the hope, then it does begin to look at like an after-the-fact order, that he was insisting that the investigation into Michael Flynn be stopped, and he punished Comey for not doing it. Now, here's a weird thing about Donald Trump, and this is the thing really to think about. Donald Trump is not loyal to his own people. Paul Manafort, his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, another of his campaign managers, one after another, he has cheerfully thrown over the side people who trusted him. And yet Michael Flynn, of all the people, is the one person who has this incredible hold on the president. Maybe there's some special bond between the two, but maybe there's something else. And that is the thing that all eyes are watching. You asked about obstruction of justice. That's a technical legal term, and there are some standards for it, and we'll be debating on TV a lot whether this technical standards for obstruction of justice have been met. But that the president was obstructing justice in the plain English sense of that term that may not be prosecutable, that's obvious. Whether there's a prosecutable crime, that's what we'll debate.
Yes, and that debate will carry on. David, great to talk to you tonight. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Straight ahead, it's decision night for Britain. Did Prime Minister Theresa May make a mistake by calling a snap election?
America's agony is growing darker, going deeper, and dividing its people as only the Civil War did in the past. Richard Nixon is a shrunken president, a man clinging to a power that is dwindling daily.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
If the many allegations made to this date are true, then the burglars who broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee after Watergate were in effect breaking into the home of every citizen of the United States.
Republican support for President Nixon on the House Judiciary Committee was clearly collapsing today.
That Richard Nixon has, beyond a reasonable doubt, committed impeachable offenses.
We have direct evidence coming out of the mouth of the President of the United States that he not only condoned, but he directed these cover-up operations.
At what point did President Nixon corruptly abuse the IRS?
I have never been a quitter, but as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Who's ever seen him? There is the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
Good evening. The President of the United States has been impeached.
In a series of 4 votes, the Republican-dominated House supported 2 articles of impeachment, alleging Clinton obstructed justice and lied under oath about his sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
The Monica Lewinsky sex scandal dominated the U.S. political scene for 1 year and 1 month, precipitating the impeachment trial. That ended today in a matter of minutes. U.S. President William Jefferson Clinton was acquitted on 2 articles of impeachment.
Not guilty.
Aides said Clinton didn't even bother watching the historic votes. Afterwards, though, he made one more apology for his misconduct before appealing to everyone to move on.
This can be, and this must be, a time of reconciliation and renewal for America.
A year after the flames were extinguished, there is sharp criticism of how the massive Fort McMurray wildfire was handled. CBC News has obtained a report that points out what went wrong last year. It says there was confusion and disorganization at the top, and that regional and provincial authorities failed to share information in the earliest, most critical days. Further, it says command centers weren't set up until the fire had already been burning a week. Radios were set at different frequencies. Infrared mapping was not ready on time. Deploying that technology earlier to chart the size and the direction of the fire would have helped firefighters. The Alberta government is now reviewing that report. Well, to the UK election now, and another chance for Britons to shape the future of their country. Exit polls have Theresa May and her Conservatives leading, but not by enough to form a majority, thanks to stiff opposition from Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Nala Ayed is in London with the latest. Nala.
Mark, it isn't what Theresa May had hoped for when she gambled and called a snap election, but it is what's coming.
The third time in 3 years Britain has been called on to vote should have been a somewhat predictable exercise. Theresa May said it was about Brexit, but in her first test since becoming Prime Minister in the wake of Brexit, Theresa May was stumbling in the election she called. In the way of the landslide she wanted were promises that rattled core supporters and just a lackluster performance. Yesterday, she was even booed. Over the course of the campaign, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn also turned the conversation to investing in healthcare and new homes, free university tuition, and 10,000 more police. Pollsters had him closing the gap. Supporters hoped this June's vote might be the end of May.
I've just voted. I'm very proud of our campaign. Thank you very much.
I think that actually Corbyn's confidence grew, his success as a politician rather than a campaigner. He grew into the role as a leader almost.
Another turning point when the campaign was interrupted twice by homegrown attackers. CCTV video was released of their takedown in London last Saturday. The attacks swerved the conversation to security and to May herself, the cuts in the police force she oversaw as Home Secretary. The extra police deployed since the attacks were keeping close watch today. Also keeping an eye out, Commonwealth election observers, including this MP from Edmonton.
We've been privileged and blessed in Canada to not undergo a lot of those attacks that we've seen across the world. It's also been incredibly enlightening to see the resilience of those from Great Britain here and excited to come out and participate in today's democracy.
In polls housed in pubs, a windmill, even a laundry, still plenty of reasons to vote, even 3 years early.
Terrorism is forefront of my mind. I'm terrified to walk down the streets in my own city.
Brexit, yeah, okay, but we need to look into the future, like, you know,
you know, the NHS, the housing, the education of the kids.
Now, if the exit poll results are confirmed, the road to Brexit may have become even more complicated. Now, Theresa May will probably hang on, but at best without the strong negotiating position that she had gambled for. Mark.
Okay, and we'll continue to follow the developments in this election through the night. Nala, thanks so much. That's Nala Ayed in London tonight. Qatar-based Al Jazeera says it is the victim of a cyber attack, another news agency targeted in a country in crisis. Al Jazeera says nothing was compromised, but it comes weeks after the state-run Qatar news agency was hacked and some misinformation was spread. That's led to a regional rumble. Here are the broad strokes. These nations cut off diplomatic and economic ties with Qatar, accusing it of supporting extremists. These two, Iran and Turkey, support Qatar. Iran today offered its ports if supplies run low. Meanwhile, Iran itself is dealing with the aftermath of terror. The number of dead from yesterday's attack has risen to 17. The attackers are now believed to be homegrown, recruited inside Iran by ISIS. Armed with guns, they stormed parliament offices and a shrine devoted to Ayatollah Khomeini, who sparked Iran's 1979 revolution. And Peter and At Issue are just minutes away. Andrew and Chantal give their take on two major announcements by the Trudeau government this week that could influence the way we're seen in the North American partnership. And later,
I've lost like 8 friends this year.
Canada confronts the overdose epidemic. Safe injection sites will soon be part of the landscape. That's coming up on The National.
You have to go for a dope test.
A track star nowadays has to be followed around by a doping official almost any time she wins a major event. What the testers are mainly looking for here is the subject of an international ban. Anabolic steroids, a derivative of the male sex hormone which is supposed to build muscle.
The athletes say all this doping control business is a bit of a waste of time and money, which is something the Canadian team does not have in abundance.
Good evening. The nation is in shock tonight over the downfall of a Canadian hero. Ben Johnson, who made the country so proud on Friday, was, just hours ago, thrown out of the Olympics for taking drugs, steroids.
Oh, that's devastating.
It makes me wonder what's happening to Canadian athletics.
It's the biggest disappointment anybody could ever imagine.
In this Montreal lab, scientists test the blood and urine of athletes for signs of drug use, signs of cheating. There's no shortage of work and much more to come now that Montreal has been named headquarters of the World Anti-Doping Agency.
There will be more pressure on Canadian athletes, but not only Canadian athletes, all athletes around the world.
Europe's fastest sprinter has become the latest athlete to test positive for a new designer steroid called THG. The drug is at the heart of a widening doping scandal in the U.S.
Fortunes have fallen for American sprinter Marion Jones.
American cyclist Floyd Landis has admitted to using performance-enhancing drugs.
Lance Armstrong has finally coughed up what was pretty much an open secret.
Do you feel disgraced? Of course.
If you're the second best athlete in the world, you might do anything to be number one. Whether there's testing or whether there isn't testing.
This is Mordecai Richler, a Canadian writer now living in England. And these are some of the things he writes.
Young people are leaving Canada, one, because they feel there is no opportunity for them at home, and two, because they're bored.
It's a small country, and if you're an English-speaking Canadian, there's certainly no capital. The cultural capitals are either New York or London.
Another reason I write is it's this continuing attempt to evolve a standard or a position or a moral posture. And I work it out in my books, and I'm still working it out.
My loyalties, or what I think of as Canada, is really Montreal, the Laurentians, the region surrounding the city. I tend to feel something of a stranger in other parts of Canada. I have no overwhelming sense of country.
I'm not the most pretentious of writers. I write for my own pleasure and for my friends, and I hope to find as wide an audience as possible. I try to be an honest witness to my times.
You have been known to make rather rude statements in public, probably slightly under the influence of...
No, that's not fair. I mean, what I mean is
I wasn't necessarily under the influence.
You mean you can be rude without drinking, is that?
If called upon.
Multiculturalism was a very well-intended notion, like most Canadian notions, but not very bright like most Canadian notions.
I'm trying to tell the truth. I don't think that it's something that has to be in season like hockey or hay fever. I think you should be able to tell the truth at any time. And if it makes people uncomfortable, I can't help it. Well, I think I'm very fortunate in that most men work at jobs they dislike intensely because they have to support a family, and most women do. So anyone who's being paid to do work he enjoys is very privileged in this world, and I don't have to ingratiate myself with anybody or taint my work in order to make it appealing. So I'm very lucky.
A new direction for Canada's foreign policy and defence policy. That's what was promised this week. Is that what was delivered? Andrew and Chantal are both here in studio tonight. Let's start by showing you how Global Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland set up her announcement this week.
The United States has truly been the indispensable nation, Mr. Speaker, for their unique 7 decades-long contribution to our shared peace and prosperity. The fact that our friend and ally has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course.
All right, so is that what happened? Did we set our own clear and sovereign course this week?
Well, they certainly, I mean, I'm struck by the language, has been the most indispensable nation. What they were certainly outlining was a fairly stinging critique of where Donald Trump has taken the United States, not just of withdrawing from the world, but, or even turning its back on it, but in some cases actually threatening some of these very important multilateral institutions that have been built up over, as she said, the 70 years. And it was certainly a sense of the rest of the civilized world, the major powers, are going to have to get their act together now. The glue in the international order is not going to be the United States, at least while Donald Trump is there. And there was some suggestion that, yes, there were opportunities for Canada to step up and play not the leadership role, but a helpful role in that regard.
Chantal, was it a clear and sovereign course?
It is not a different course. If you look at all the fundamentals, we're still doing what we were doing yesterday. And a year ago, most of what was in that speech wouldn't have made it in the speech because it was taken for granted, and it was also U.S. policy. But what was possibly more striking than anything we've seen before is the fact that our minister went to the House of Commons to point out all these differences. When the U.S. refused to sign the Kyoto Accord, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the day didn't stand up in the House of Commons to say that the administration in the White House was threatening the world order or walking away from leadership. And when George W. Bush set out to go to Iraq without having the blessing of the UN, and we didn't go, it was already considered a faux pas on the part of Jean Chrétien to have been so affirmative about not going and dismissing the idea in the House of Commons, and he did that over answers in question period. He didn't have his minister deliver an entire lecture to George W. Bush. So the package matters more, I think, on this than the content, but I would argue that she was not really setting up so much a different foreign policy as setting up a substantial increase in military spending the next day and trying to give it meaning other than we're caving in to Trump and we're going to spend all this money on defense.
Okay, we'll get to the defense portion of this in a second, but I don't want to leave the, I mean, we've been waiting, some time. They've been promising a major speech on foreign policy, which is expected with a new government, and yet it seemed that what we got was basically a reaction to what the Americans are not doing anymore.
That's right. It's not that there was a change in policy, it's that the situation has changed. So merely maintaining the same policy now looks fairly radical. And I don't want to understate that. I mean, we can talk about how that intersects with the defense review, but I think this was not the language and the tone that this government had been striking until now. It had been some would say sucking up to the president, and I think the rest of the world also. People were sort of trying to sort of court his favor one by one. I think there's been a growing realization in world capitals that this is never going to change. He's never going to smarten up and become like a normal president. You're not going to be able to charm him into it, and that there's some real dangers here. When he goes and says, well, Article 5 is not necessarily, the collective defense provision of NATO is not necessarily sacrosanct, then the rest of that organization has to think, okay, how do we adjust to that? I will say I think the timing is not coincidental, that I think there's a sense and a reality that Trump is greatly weakened as a president. If he were at 60% in the approval ratings, we'd be having a very different conversation. But he's now down in the 30s, and we're all watching the Comey testimony. He's in a lot of trouble, and that changes your calculation in foreign capitals.
But there is also the fact that over the past 6 months, other things have happened. For instance, the French election. For instance, the fact that Angela Merkel is being solidified in her position on the way to re-election by Trump. 4 months ago, when we were sitting here, there was a lot of uncertainty over whether there would be a Trump effect, a domino effect that would produce a French government in the same mold that would see Angela Merkel destabilized. That is not happening. He has actually solidified Western Europe, this president, over the course of the past few months, and has realistically given Canada and Justin Trudeau some friends at the table who weigh more than we do. That being said, I don't believe you can take the speech, the Freeland speech, and separate it from the defense policy. It was a 1-2 punch, and the proof of a change in policy is still where money talks. And where money talked this week, the only place where it talked loudly was in doing something that Donald Trump has been vocally calling for, which is more defense spending.
All right. Well, here's the Defense Minister, Sajjan, and his remarks on the new defense policy.
This is about our responsibility to the world and how we work with our allies. So we have taken that into account. Yes, we did talk with our NATO partners on some of the costing to be able to look at, so that we look at all of the investments that we do.
All right, so the interesting part of this then, in this doubling of two policy announcements, is one day they look like they're whacking Trump, and the next day they look like they're doing exactly what he asked them to do.
Right, and it's tempting to say, well, it's just all because of that. The foreign policy statement was just a way of covering the fact that they're now going to do Trump's bidding. I don't doubt there's some element of that, but I think in a way, it's giving them too much credit. There's a lot in that defense paper that amounts to rowing back from policy statements they made during the election. For example, they've essentially turned their back on peacekeeping, which was going to be a big thing in the election platform. So the suggestion is that what they ran on during the election was the real liberals, and now they're just changing their mind because Trump made them do it. I think there may be more of an element of this is actually where they intend to go. The other suggestion is that there's some enormous political risk in raising defense spending. There's some on the left, but I don't think it's as great as all that. And the trade-off, this risk-return trade-off of making this very stinging foreign policy statement to give you cover for your acquiescence in Trump's demands, they're not making that much of an increase in defense spending, first of all. They're not actually meeting anywhere close to the 2% of GDP target, even 10 years
They're
ago.
hinting that the math can be jiggled around. They've learned lessons
future
from
governments
others.
might somewhere get near it. Is a little different. And you've pretty much washed your hands of them in your foreign policy statement. I'm not sure the risk-reward is all that great. It might have that additional advantage, but I just don't think that's the only reason.
To believe that politics does not have anything to do with policy is kind of believing that angels are suddenly living on Parliament Hill. And
I don't think that's what I said, by the way.
No, but
they're not living on Parliament
you said they're not smart enough to have necessarily. That's even worse. But they have managed to cast the notion that we spend more on defense to fill the void and mitigate the risk to the international world order that Trump is, rather than as Canada is trying to curry favor by spending on defense. That being said, they have not budgeted for this spending. We are still waiting to see a budget track to anything except larger deficits, and they have actually not committed to spending all that much money until they are re-elected and then re-elected. Right. And they are hardly the first government to do that. But the difference between them and the Conservatives is they certainly did not campaign on doing this, and it was not on their radar until January.
So if you're looking at Canada from the other side of the ocean or the other side of the world, after this week of 2 major policy announcements, does the country look different to our allies and to our not allies?
Were they paying attention?
Or were they paying attention?
Naturally, they were rapt. I think a little bit. I think there was a more clear casting of our lot with the Europeans, that we're going to have a sort of a common front in dealing with Trump. That I think there's a suggestion of that. And look, there's this whole question of what is NATO going to mean? How are we going to make sure that the members of NATO are actually be defended? If you're the Baltic states right now. And yes, it's going to require all of us to step up. You know, we can't just rely on the states. We probably shouldn't have in the past, and there's real questions about whether we even can now. So I would imagine Canada was not just getting pressure from the Americans to step up, but from our other fellow NATO partners.
All right, you get the final word, Chantal.
I agree. And to belabor the point, if they had only done defense and not the other speech this week, the optics here would be more difficult.
Okay. Thank you both. Rex normally comes in at this point, but for this week, due to the crush of other news, we've asked Mr. Murphy to hold his thoughts for a day. The National will be back in a moment with Mark.
I think a lot of the fellas make a mistake looking for a girl that's absolutely perfect. Of course, I mean, you like to try and make her as almost perfect as you can, but I think you should learn to get along with the bad qualities and the good qualities.
What's your opinion on this business of going steady?
I think it's something that it just shouldn't be.
You mean it hasn't happened to you yet?
Not exactly.
It will someday. Don't look so smug.
I started dating when I was about 12 or 13.
Well, so the prestige of having a boyfriend.
I don't know, I think you get too tied down. It's almost like getting married.
How do you make up your mind how far you're going to go on a date? Or it depends on the girl.
Well, I've recently met a fellow who believes that without exception, men, women, whether they're separated, divorced, or 3-time losers, still cling to the hope that somehow, somewhere, there's someone just for them. He's Morton Victor, who tried to speed the process of natural selection by organizing a singles festival.
Being single could be very frustrating. It could be very depressing at times.
Just came to meet some nice young girl.
Well, maybe in the sense to meet somebody.
Well, to meet some girls.
You have to go looking for men?
No, I don't, but I mean, there's something new or something like that. I don't know.
Single and lonely and looking for love. A growing number of Canadians find themselves in precisely that situation these days.
The big problem today is the eternal one of finding someone who thinks you're as kind, sweet, sexy, sophisticated, witty, and intelligent as you know yourself to be. Where, oh where, to find such an extraordinary animal.
When your opening line is in a newspaper, you can say whatever you want. It's something single people in Toronto are doing more than ever.
You have total and complete anonymity.
Do you believe that you can find the woman of your dreams?
If you have the persistence to not be disappointed, by all rights, the heart should take over when you do meet the right person anyhow.
Zippity-doo-dah, zippity-day. My, oh my, what a wonderful day. Hey!
Ryan Gosling is on top of the world. Well, at least the entertainment world. He's a mouseketeer.
Hey, Ma, I'm home.
It's really neat because he kind of laid low and he did, he said, we picked out of a lot of talented kids and everything, Ryan, and, I wanted you to know that you're a mouseketeer. And I went, no way. And my mom she hit the roof.
My biggest feeling was just that I was so happy for Ryan. I was happy that he got a yes answer.
Ryan had already caught a lot of eyes with his feet. He'd won an Ottawa talent show, Homegrown Cafe, and several dance competitions in the United States as well. But it was his clean-cut looks and his singing which won him an audition with Disney officials last month in Florida.
She that travel around this floor and put you down. So people, let me put you on.
Now, after signing a 1-year contract, he'll do singing and dancing on the Mickey Mouse Club.
To me, it's luck because there was kids there that were just phenomenal, so luck.
Canada's oldest retailer is cutting 2,000 jobs, a move the Hudson's Bay company says will eventually save it $350 million a year. The news came as HBC announced its first quarter sales were down $100 million. The company says some of the cuts were made back in February and that most of the job losses will be in the U.S. An update now on a CBC News investigation into Air Transat. Last week, we told you about the airline's attempts to mislead passengers with deliberate stops on flights to Mexico that were advertised as direct. Well, today, on a conference call with investors, Air Transat seemed to deny any wrongdoing and suggested it's all about customers misunderstanding their bookings. Aaron Saltzman explains.
Air Transat's second quarter earnings came out today, and they were pretty good. But the company has hit some turbulence recently.
Have you seen any, impact to either the customer satisfaction or brand?
An analyst asked that question on Air Transat's earnings call today. The answer from an Air Transat executive.
Okay, you're talking about the article from CBC.
A CBC investigation found Air Transat instructed a partner, Flair Air, to mislead aviation officials and passengers about unscheduled stops on flights from Mexico, because Flair's fleet of older 737-400s could not make those flights without landing to refuel.
We were under the impression that we were headed straight there.
That's specifically why Jessica Spencer booked tickets for her Cancun wedding on Air Transat. But the flights she and her wedding guests traveled on all stopped to refuel, adding hours to their travel times. CBC's investigation found that same weekly direct flight from Kelowna, which has no stops listed, stopped to refuel on 11 consecutive flights. When Spencer's wedding planner complained to Air Transat, she was told, "We do not promote our flights as non-stop, and as you must know, direct flights may entail stops along the way."
Although it might be like known flight terminology that direct equates to possible stopovers along the way, the general public for the most part doesn't really understand that.
But on that earnings call today, Air Transat repeated the same message.
Most of the flights, even if you do a stop, it's a direct flight.
He didn't answer whether or not the controversy has affected their customer satisfaction or brand. After our investigation, passengers on other airlines, such as Sunwing, also complained about unscheduled stops. Sunwing says those are rare and only happen when faced with heavier payload or strong headwinds. In the end, if you're booking a flight and you want to make sure you get there without landing along the way, look for one that explicitly states non-stop. Aaron Saltzman, CBC News, Toronto.
With Canada's opioid crisis growing worse by the day, this couldn't come too soon. Today, a new safe injection site opened in BC, the first in the province outside of Vancouver. But as Briar Stewart reports, many more are needed right across the country.
It's known as the Strip. 50 or so tents lined up on the sidewalk in Surrey, BC. Everyone here has their struggles. Addiction is rampant.
And it comes with a pair of gloves.
Which is why Scott McFarland always carries the opioid antidote, naloxone.
I've Narcan 6 people myself this year. So, I see it all the time. It's just like it becomes part of the ambulances and people ODing seems to just become part of the whole scenery, right?
In 2016, there were 400 overdoses in this area alone in Surrey. And this year, there's been a big spike. Since January, there's already been 300 overdoses. When it comes to deaths from overdoses, this community has the second highest number in BC after Vancouver, which is why outreach workers say there's a big need for this, a supervised consumption site.
This is the first supervised consumption site that we've opened since the emergency was declared in BC.
And you can just kind of
The opioid emergency. Because of it, cities across the country are working to set up similar sites. 12 new ones have been approved by Health Canada, including 4 in Montreal and 3 in Toronto.
Would come to access supervised injection service.
7 other communities have also applied to set up sites and are waiting for the go-ahead from Ottawa. This professor says there has been a noticeable shift in public opinion when it comes to supervised injection.
More people are aware of these sites, and they're also more willing to have a discussion about them. That doesn't mean that there aren't opponents to them. There are, but even more governments are willing to, local governments, to discuss these sites and move forward.
They'll be called into this room here.
As for Surrey, people will only be able to use needles in these booths. For drugs to be taken orally or inhaled through the nose, there needs to be special permission from Health Canada. Local officials are still waiting for that. It's disappointing, they say, given the urgency.
I've lost 8 friends this year. 8 friends.
Scott McFarland hopes the new site will save lives and prevent more names from being added to this poster, remembering all of those who have died. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Surrey.
British Columbia's first minority government in 65 years was sworn in today.
I, Christy Clark,
do swear that I will...
Christy Clark took the oath of office as Premier, but her Liberal Party isn't expected to keep power for long. The NDP and Greens say they'll work together to defeat the Liberals in a confidence vote soon after the new session of the BC legislature begins on June 22nd. Most of Canada's other premiers wrapped up 2 days of meetings in Washington today. They were in the U.S. preparing for the renegotiation of NAFTA. Most say they're in favor of small changes to modernize the trade agreement, but not a complete overhaul. Well, 2 fishing boats that had been trapped in sea ice off northeastern Newfoundland for 2 days were finally able to break free and return to shore today. Yesterday, several other fishermen had to be airlifted to safety after thick ice crushed their vessel. The unusually heavy Arctic ice pack is up to 2 meters thick and extends 20 kilometers from shore in some places. And though it could start moving out to sea this weekend, other hazards remain, big ones. Today, the CBC's Zach Gowdy joined a special crew on iceberg patrol.
There's iceberg hunting, and then there's iceberg hunting. This berg towers above the endless sea ice as it begins the long voyage down the Labrador coast.
So today we're flying north, which is always a busy flight. Every time it's a busy flight, just because all the icebergs are coming down the Labrador coast in the Labrador Current. We found probably 300 or 400 so far.
The day begins at the St. John's International Airport. We take off and head north. Today, the patrol is going up and then down Iceberg Alley, the flow of ocean current that takes bergs from Greenland down the Labrador coast and on to Newfoundland. But that current intersects with one of the world's busiest shipping lanes.
When we have icebergs in that area, we set an iceberg limit, which is basically saying if the ships stay to the south and to the east of that line, they'll stay out of the danger of iceberg collision. So they may have to adjust their course up to 400 miles out of their way to go around that dangerous area of icebergs.
Yeah, the controls that autothrottle disengaged, autopilot selected.
Sophisticated radar helps with ice detection, but up here, there are millions of pieces of ice floating on the surface. That's where the crew comes in.
Sometimes the radar has a really hard time finding the difference between sea ice and an iceberg. An iceberg is coming from a glacier, normally from Greenland, and sea ice is just the surface of the ocean that's frozen.
The International Ice Patrol was created in 1913 in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster. It has flown in every iceberg season since, except during the 2 world wars. Now, this season is winding down.
I think the most important thing is this is something that not everybody gets to do, and it feels special. You feel like you're doing something that's not only important to the maritime community, but it's just so unique. How could you pass it up?
Zach Gowdy, CBC News, near the coast of Labrador.
The nearly month-long strike that forced the closure of Canada's largest zoo may soon be over. Today, a tentative agreement was reached between the Toronto Zoo and the union representing its 400 striking workers. If ratified, the zoo could reopen next week. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, game, set, match. It was a good day for Canada at the French Open. First, a quick look at the day's business numbers. The TSX rose 50 points. The dollar fell almost a tenth of a cent. In New York, the Dow gained 8 points, but the price of oil dropped 8 cents a barrel.
I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. Tomorrow on The Current, criminologist Michael Arntfield studies the writings of killers, their prose, their poetry, to try to predict other future murders. Murder in Plain English on The Current, weekdays at 8:30 on CBC Radio 1.
The amazing Alouette has outperformed anything that's been shot into space since the Russians started it with Sputnik 1. The mere fact that it's still faithfully sending back messages from the top side of the ionosphere is enough to make it remarkable. When it was launched in September of 1962, its designers figured that with luck it would operate for a year. As of right now, it's been in orbit for 5 years and 7 months, and 3 of the 6 original batteries are still working.
It was a picture that Canadian engineers had waited 6 years to see, and for which Canadian taxpayers paid $100 million. A giant space robot with Canada's name on it and the Earth above. The remote manipulator system performing perfectly.
Okay, and be advised that we're looking at a great picture.
Good evening. It was a spectacular liftoff and a history-making day for Canada. The shuttle Challenger blasted off the pad at Cape Canaveral at dawn. On board, astronaut Marc Garneau, the very first Canadian in space.
This trip into space for me has turned out to be more than ever I could have hoped for. It's a great honor for me to represent Canada in space.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery and the first International Microgravity Laboratory.
Good evening. There's a Canadian in the heavens tonight, Roberta Bonder, going around in circles and entirely happy about it. Canada's second astronaut in space. She's orbiting planet Earth about 300 kilometers straight up. She left from this space center this morning, 59 minutes later than scheduled, but after a lifetime of anticipation, those minutes probably won't mean very much in the long run.
Incredible view.
A crucial spacewalk took place in the skies above us early today, and Canadian astronaut Julie Payette was in charge. Payette coordinated the mission from onboard the Space Shuttle Discovery.
History was made high in the sky today. For the very first time, a Canadian walked in space. Early this morning, astronaut Chris Hadfield began installing Canadarm2, and with it, launched a new era for the International Space Station.
With great humility and pleasure, I accept command of the International Space Station.
You know why I want to get back soon.
The National. The National.
Tonight.
Ottawa's Gabby Dabrowski made tennis history today as the first Canadian woman to capture a Grand Slam title. Gabby and her partner, India's Rohan Bopanna, won the mixed doubles final at the French Open in a hard-fought battle. It was the third Grand Slam appearance for the pair. They competed at the Australian Open earlier this year and the US Open last summer. The last Canadian woman to make the mixed doubles finals was Jill Hetherington back in 1995. Well, with the official start of summer quickly bearing down, you may be combing Airbnb for that sweet holiday deal. Well, here's one for those who want a fresh new experience. It's called the Zero Star Hotel, high up in the Swiss Alps, and it's now taking reservations. No roof, no walls, just you and the actual stars. For the not-so-low price of 295 Swiss francs per night, that's about $400. Created by a pair of artist brothers, the hotel is a playful take on traditional hospitality. But before you book, we should point out that wolves are making a comeback. in Switzerland. That's the National for this Thursday night. For news at any hour, you can always go to our website, cbcnews.ca. I'm Mark Kelly. Thanks so much for watching.